So I'm sitting here with series creator and executive producer Joe Weisberg and executive producer Joel Fields. Give them a round of applause. And a Russian nesting doll. This has, you can't. We'll talk in the lobby. Yeah. So this is a Russian nesting doll of a show, and I hope we'll get to talk about some of the layers here. But for starters, I want to ask, how do you feel? How do you feel now?
I have to admit that the primary emotion I'm feeling is relief. You know, it's been 6 years, it's been 6 great years, but the potential to fuck it all up at the very end is so high, and we seem to have not fucked it up. So I'm mostly relieved.
I'm still unconvinced and stressed out.
Are you still waiting for the reaction? Yeah.
Well, he's been reading the reviews, and I've had my head in the sand.
Really?
But he tells me.
Well, spoiler alert, they're positive.
Okay, that's what he says.
They're positive. So, okay, so let's briefly take it back to the very beginning.
Oh my God.
Henry!
Yes. Yes, indeed. The germ of this idea, tell us, like, what was the road to the pilot like? What did people say about this idea before somebody finally said yes to it?
We pitched this around to a lot of places and got a lot of sort of respectful nods. Oh, that's interesting. Sounds really good. But I think that deep down inside people, there was a lot of sort of horror at the idea that you could take KGB spies and turn them into the heroes of a show. That was not really appealing to anyone except at FX, where it was really genuinely like, that's fantastic, yeah, let's definitely do that. Because that was a network where doing things that were unconventional or different or weird was what appealed to them. That's what their network was. So that was the only place of all the places that we took it that wanted to do it, and we're excited about it from the start.
Now tell me about your partnership a little bit. Like, at what point did Joel come on board?
Well, after we shot the pilot, you know, back then, and this still happens sometimes, you shoot a pilot without any idea if they're going to actually make a show. So we shot the pilot, and the network decided they wanted to actually make a show out of it, at which point everybody knew I'd worked in television for only about 2 years at that point. I didn't know much about actually making a show, so I needed a lot of help. And I started getting calls, and Joel started getting calls. My calls were like, there's a guy we think you'd really like named Joel Fields.
So you hadn't met before?
Never met.
Vietnam.
Never met. Never met.
So it's a blind date?
It was
It was
very
a arranged marriage.
But under the circumstances where this type of arranged marriage exists a lot in television, where somebody who's created a show but doesn't have a lot of experience with TV is paired with a showrunner who has a lot of experience in TV, and the failure rate is like 98%. So it's risky.
No pressure.
No pressure. You'll love each other.
Were there any ground rules, any dramatic or stylistic ground rules that you had to hammer out beforehand? Like, here are the things we're going to do, here are the things we're not going to do, here are the lines we're not going to cross, here are places we're not going to go.
Well, it's funny because we created those ground rules both in terms of writing and style and in terms of our own process as we went. But we spent a lot of time talking about them very clearly. And really when we were in the trenches in that first season, when we didn't have time to do it, we still took time to talk through how we're going to work together, how we're going to trust each other, how we're going to communicate with each other. And we also talked about the creative ground rules, but it was less about, well, we're going to have this portion of spy story and this portion of marriage story, and more, I think, about how we were going to pursue our creative feelings for the material. What was going to be our true north that we were going to pursue together. And I think all that talking about it paid a lot of dividends. And I think one of the big moments for us is when we wrote our first script together. Joe wrote, there were some rewrites and reshoots of the pilot that we sort of worked on and talked about together. But Joe wrote then the first script, which was The Clock. It was called The Clock. And then I wrote Gregory. And then the third episode was...
There was a gasp when you said Gregory. That's one of my favorites too. But
and then there was the Reagan episode, which I forget what we called it. But...
they know.
Huh?
You can say it.
In Control. Oh, yes. Al Haig, he was in control there.
The great thing is with this crowd, if you falter, they can prompt you.
And I think sitting down and really from that moment on, we wrote everything together. And we did all the rewriting together.
Were you writing remotely, like you email it back and forth? You literally in the same room?
There were a couple times that first season where I remember we wrote remotely and emailed back, but that was only because one of us was out of town. But mostly we sat in the same room, and that was I think the big breakthrough for us, was realizing that we were just more efficient creatively and producerially when we were together.
Right. So one of the things that strikes me about the show, like having gone back, I've seen every episode of the show a few times, and I just recently finished, like I didn't rewatch every single episode leading into the finale, but I tried to sample little bits and pieces just to see the flow of things. And one of the things that struck me about it was I had thought of this show as almost like it's in the wheelhouse of a Breaking Bad or Sopranos or one of the kind of anti-hero driven shows. But one of the things that differentiated it for me is the characters are not self-aware. Like one of the things that makes Walter White or Tony Soprano compelling is that they're right on the edge of truly being self-aware of themselves as human beings, psychological creatures, but also like characters in a drama, right? The characters on this play aren't like that. I said a play, but they're not like that. And is that a deliberate choice that you made, and what did that contribute? What did that give you that was positive, and what difficulties did it create?
We were very self-aware from the start of how unself-aware they were. And it seemed fundamental to us, just as who they were, that they got themselves trapped into this life in the first place. We didn't think that would happen to self-aware people. And we looked at how they'd grown up, who they were as kids, how they would end up joining the CIA, just the act of becoming a spy, and then raising kids in this kind of arranged marriage, not telling them who you were. We didn't think self-aware people would do that. So it became our sort of a watchword of the whole process of developing the characters and writing the scripts, that we would sometimes joke, who's the least self-aware person between Philip, Elizabeth, Stan, everyone else? But it was a joke because they were all deeply, deeply self-unaware. and
even when they're nest.
Well, that was the idea, is that Philip would slowly gain a little bit of self-awareness as the series went on. Not a lot, but a little bit.
Just enough to mess things up.
Just enough to make it interesting
And
have the relationship, develop and struggle. And then Elizabeth, as opposed to Philip, was going to it's not that she was going to change at all, but she would have little cracks. Each season there'd be like one little crack that developed in her, and maybe at the end of the series, as we thought at the beginning, maybe at the end of the series, a couple of the cracks will meet. But she'd be like moving like a snail, and he'd be moving more like a worm. But it also was very interesting in the writing process, because whenever scripts would come in, we would then send the writer back and say, okay, this is good. Now do a pass where you take out anything in it where they seem self-aware.
Right.
And that was with that. And we did it on our own scripts too.
Did you find self-awareness creeping in, and you had to do
All the time.
go through it with a weed whacker and
Yes,
get
you
rid of that?
cannot. Nobody, including us, could write a script without self-awareness creeping in. It's just almost impossible. Even when we got good at it, it still creeps in.
And we cut it all. The joke in the writer's offices, we'd bring writers in and talk about a scene, and we'd say, okay, here's the scene, and we'd talk for 45 minutes to an hour about all of the emotional context of the scene, and then at the end we'd say, just remember, they're unaware of all of that. Good luck.
That's great. So because the finale is fresh in everyone's minds, I want to talk about a few key sections of it in detail. We're gonna Zapruder this. Okay, so can we go to the next slide? Okay, so McDonald's. This is probably the best use of a fast food restaurant for iconic Americana significance since probably Mad Men. And McDonald's of all places. Why McDonald's?
By the way, it's so great to see this, because when we dreamed this up, it's actually rare, even over 6 years of the show, to have your dream turn into a visual that is exactly how you dreamed it.
Yeah,
There
it happens from once a season.
Yeah.
Yeah. And look, that's really, that image is just a masterpiece gift from Chris Long and the production design team, because that McDonald's does not exist.
Really?
So
What is
it was
it?
very hard to find a period, well, it is a McDonald's, but it was very hard to, but it's not in that location at all. we wanted to find that classic roadside McDonald's, what Chris Long called the Super Bowl McDonald's from the mid '80s, and that just doesn't exist at a roadside anymore. They've all been remodeled, so we had to find this one remaining period McDonald's, which was it in Queens or something? But it's
Wow.
they are surrounded by.
Can we get a fourth chair
up here? Yeah. But everything you see there is that was just slathered in green screen.
How do you know that?
Instagram.
That's amazing. Anyway, I'm
So
sorry.
yeah, slathered in green screen and pieced together to create the images you saw.
Oh, okay.
And then we worked actually with McDonald's, whom we were delighted to find corporately is as obsessed with period accuracy as we are. So they helped us get all of the wrapping and signage and everything to take us right back to
That's
the
fantastic. So they
80s.
weren't at all concerned, like, we don't want, murderous assassin spies eating
Well,
our
this-
burgers.
this
Funny
was
moment, actually.
This was the genius thing because with all these things you have to clear it and you have to get the corporation to say yes, and they didn't know that much about the Americans, and fortunately the finale doesn't really have anything terrible in it. So first we sent them to the scene and they were like, oh, that scene looks okay, what about the rest of the episode? And we were like,
basically they ride a train.
Yeah, it's all
Elizabeth
good.
has a dream, and they get some McDonald's. That's basically it. Oh, and they have a chat in a parking garage. That's the show. And they said that's great.
Fantastic. All right. So,
But it had to be McDonald's.
Yeah,
If
no.
it wasn't McDonald's, we didn't really have a fallback. When it seemed like it was really down to the wire, like a day, if it didn't clear the day it cleared, we were going to like our fallback plan,
which was what, Waffle House?
No, we couldn't find any other restaurant that worked. We were going to go into like a roadside like convenience store, and it was going to be like 1/10 as good. So it was a close call.
Yeah. Okay. So next image, the parking garage. Speaking of the parking garage, let's talk about the parking garage. This, to me, it was funny because I wrote my piece on the finale and I thought, wow, this seems like a little self-contained play. And I think that was not an accident. Was that something that happened in the writing? Or was it something that happened in the directing? How did this come about? Because it feels the least, this is a show that is very televisual, it's very proud of its TV-ness and the way that it's serialized, and also it's not a fussy show. It's a very stylishly made show. It has a certain aesthetic, but it's not like a knock you out every 4 seconds with the camera flipping over and over and stuff. You're not putting the camera inside of a toaster, usually, right?
Right.
But this is the most sort of visually, dramatically naked sequence in the whole show. Talk to me about the idea behind that.
Yeah.
Well, that I think really is a testament to the courage of Chris Long, who's our producing director and who directed the final 2 episodes. We talked to him about it, and he said that he ran through all of the options in his mind, including fancy camera angles and steady cams and a lot of movement, and he just decided to go with what felt right to him, which was filming the scene as it would have happened in our heads. And that's always been the guide to us on the show from the beginning. In writing, we imagined that this was, in our heads, a real story that was happening, and if you accepted that premise, if you said, okay, these are real characters, they're really going through these things, so what would happen in reality? Not with any clever plot twists, not with any kind of surprising things that the writers throw in, but just if this were real, even if it's taking a little longer, even if it's, a little bit of boring spy stuff, let's have them follow each other rather than get chased. And I think that eventually became part of the way the show was designed and directed as well, and there you see it in this scene.
I mean, it's fun. This is the first time I'm ever having this association now. It's probably because of all the things you said, but I'm now associating it and things you said too to digging the hole, because that was another thing that was also an act. I mean, it was a teaser. It wasn't as long as this, but it was long, and it was the same idea of make it completely realistic. How would it actually look? What would it actually be like to just dig a hole? Nobody said anything there.
Yes.
But it was a long, long act of realism.
They don't really even move. They're just standing there.
They'd get shot.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's like a piece of public theater. It's like when actors go out on the street and just act in the park or something. Yeah. But yeah.
But it's tense.
It is. Now, so Stan lets them. Yeah, I love that expression. So Stan lets them go. That was not what I don't know if anybody saw this particular scene coming. Like I thought, like because I had been trained by all of these other anti-hero driven crime shows, I thought, one or both of them ends up dead, one or both of them ends up in jail, maybe one turns state witness against the other. Stan lives, Stan dies. I was thinking in terms of those binaries. It's either living or dead, in jail or not. I didn't expect this. How did you make this justified?
Well,
From Stan, because to me this is like, Philip is doing the heavy lifting in this scene.
Yeah.
Like he's the active one, but it's all happening here. Like he's the guy who decides whether they live or die, go to jail or stay free.
I want to say first that was to our great advantage that everybody's trained to expect something else. It's not why we did it. The reason we did it was we asked ourselves what felt most true, what felt most honest and real to the characters and the stories and the relationships we'd been building for 6 years. That's how we came up with the story. But then secondarily, the fact that it will be a surprise because everybody has to expect what you're talking about from all the other stories they've seen, that really works to our benefit as storytellers. So that was good for us. But making it, just because it was true, doesn't mean it's going to be easy. And when we knew that we had to write this scene where that was going to feel real and believable and work, I think it was the greatest challenge we ever faced, writing a scene. And we spent more time writing and rewriting the scene than any scene we'd ever done in the history of the show.
Really?
More drafts of it, more actual time working on it, more times that we put it aside. And at least for me, I don't know if you shared this anxiety as much as I did or not, but more times when I thought, I'm not sure we're going to get there.
What were the sticking points? What were the things that were issues?
Well, the shape of the scene was always the same, and that we had from its early conception and then an outline, but exactly how everything was going to get laid out, what would and wouldn't come up, and even more importantly, in what order would things burst out of these characters. Every time you changed one thing, when is Stan going to mention Gennady and Sophia? If so, when in the scene? Is he going to mention Matthew? Who brings up Henry? How does it land? It was all had to be just right. And we were rewriting it really up until a couple days before the read-through. I think it's a place where our being obsessive planners and doing drafts early worked to our advantage, because we had the story very early, so it got to cook in our subconscious for a long time, and then we wrote our first draft early and then had months, I think, to rewrite the scene. And finally, a couple days before the read-through, I think we got it to a place where we thought, at least we can let him read it. And once we saw Matthew, Noah, Carrie, and Holly read through the scene at the read-through, we looked at each other and knew we'd be okay.
But a small hitch made the whole scene feel false. It was like a fragile scene.
Yes. Was there anything, was it all on the page, or was there were there things that were done when you were shooting, when you were editing, that put it over the finish line?
Well, there are a couple things. One that was added, that Chris Long added on set, was the moment where Stan is standing in front of the car and then moves to let them go by.
Right.
So he came up with that. He said to us when we got there for the rehearsal that moment, he said, there's no moment where you see Stan's decision to let them go, which it's to me fascinating that we didn't recognize that when we were writing, but sometimes you don't. That was obviously in
So that was not on the page.
that wasn't
gesture.
on the page. I guess in our minds, the whole scene was about that, so we missed the fact that there was not a moment for the audience to get the decision. But that's part of Chris's job and brilliance as a director, is to see that actual instant isn't there, so he put that in, and of course, it's like the moment of the scene, so thank God for Chris Long. And he found a way to visualize it brilliantly. It's so moving and good. And then in editing also, that moment that Joel mentioned where Stan brings up Gennady and Sophia got moved. It just got moved to a little bit later
There's a whole
in the
chunk
scene.
of dialogue, a whole run there that we wound up moving to later in the scene.
Interesting. And also the way Noah Emmerich plays that gesture is great, because it's like his body is a door and he is opening the door to let them out. That's something that didn't even dawn on me until I've watched this 3 times now. I'm obsessed with this finale. So let's talk about the next sequence, the phone call. Yeah, that's kind of a pilot of Miami Vice shot right there, isn't it? The phone booth, the lights of the phone booth. Okay, so now they don't get to really say goodbye. Be completely unaware. Talk to me about this scene?
Boy, it's very.
Boy.
It's really painful.
We've seen it a lot of times
It's
too.
really
It's
painful.
very
It's really
emotional.
agonizing. If you have kids or have been a kid, it hurts to see
Yeah.
this.
Yeah,
The rest of his life, this kid's going to be dealing with this.
yeah, and Kedrick's so great in this scene.
I love
Boy.
he's just a little eye roll at the end. He's like, okay, I gotta
Right.
go.
Yeah.
You know, he said something at the different panel we did that he just played this like all the times. His dad's calling, he doesn't feel like talking to him.
Yeah.
He just channeled all of that.
He has no idea.
Right, right.
Did you, when you do scenes where people are talking on the phone, do you ever have the actors talking to each other, like in different locations, or do you have somebody like physically on the phone talking to them, or do you just have someone else reading their lines?
No, we have done it both ways, and I honestly don't recall. Although I actually think, if I could be making this up, so this could be completely made up. I have a vague recollection of Chris Long saying that when he shot this scene, Kedrick's side, which was shot very early in the process, that he wanted the script supervisor to do it because he wanted it to feel banal for Kedrick.
Interesting.
That's interesting.
So depriving him of the sounds of his family's voice.
That's right.
Huh. That's very sneaky.
Also, I might have made it up.
That's great. So, all right. So let's skip ahead to the train. The train. First of all, the music. With or without you. The music, the use of music on the show has been much remarked upon, and it's characterized often by deep cuts. Like you try to avoid. I've noticed you either go really, really deep with the cut, or you brazenly grab a song that everyone knows. Like, you know what? We're going to stamp the Americans on this now. Like, "In the Air Tonight" is my favorite example of that. It was like, and I said this. Forgive me if you've heard this before from 2 nights ago, but. When I first watched the pilot and used "In the Air Tonight," which was used, I think, in Miami Vice, the pilot, you know, one of the best uses of music in the history of television, and they successfully stole that away from Risky Business, which was not easy to do.
That's right.
Right? So it was property of Michael Mann, and now I think it's property of the Americans. But when I saw that, I thought, what nerve. What unbelievable nerve to do that. But you haven't done that very often, but you did that here. You went with a big song, one that everybody knows. Why?
I mean, I think we've always had the attitude that you have to, you know, people ask us all the time about Russian politics, and we say, well, we write in a bubble, we're in the 80s, what's happening today doesn't exist, and it's important to write that way. But I think it's true for music and everything else as well. You have to kind of pretend that you're in a bubble and other TV shows don't exist. It can be, you can make some mistakes that way, but I think it's the only way to do it, because this is a universe, and it's not a multiverse.
Right.
And for us, the song choices have always been about finding what feels right. And you know, the thing about this song that was, before we heard it there, we thought, God, the lyric, it's so exactly about what's going on. But I think in a lot of ways, because it foreshadows rather than comments on,
Right.
it worked for us. I remember we were struggling in this sequence because we listened to so many songs. And then this idea came up, and the first thing we did was go to our phones to see when the album had come out. And boy, we were just there. It had been released in '87, and we knew we were at the end of December of '87, so we were okay.
Right. Were there any other songs you considered?
There were many, and we won't.
An
tell you.
endless
And
number.
no.
An endless number.
This moment here. Did she always get off the train of her own accord?
No. I mean, if of
Yes,
her own accord,
yes,
she was
she
never.
always got off the train of her
Once
own
she was
accord,
getting off
but
the
it
train, it was
wasn't
of her own
always a train.
accord.
Oh, it wasn't always a train.
I think that's what you
okay.
meant to say.
What,
Well, I
what
meant-
were the different versions of this sequence then, I guess, I should say? It wasn't always on a train.
It was every possible means of transport that one could take was a means of transport they took out of the country before they ended up on a train. But also in original versions of this story, it wasn't always. Page was going back with them at one point. I mean, there were versions. Henry went back, Page went back.
But those were very. We never wrote any of those versions. Those were just kind of options that were on the table.
Right. Did this here, let's hold on this for a second. this image, a friend of mine on Twitter caught something, which I'm going to show you. Right, okay, so she's got her hand up on the glass, and then it's like this, next slide, this painting. It's on the wall behind her. Did you do that on purpose? Is that something is that an Easter egg for us, or?
No.
No.
But
Well,
it's great. I mean, it's
I will
beautiful.
say, Joe and I are big believers in the Jungian subconscious and the role of the subconscious in writing. In fact, we bonded a lot on it over the course of the first season, and I'd like to think that on some level that's in there.
But that would probably be
because
more,
that's a nice story.
it's beautiful. But that would be more Chris's unconscious than ours, I think.
Yeah.
But Chris spent a lot of time looking at that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, well, and also, this is something else I want to talk about, the difference between, you talked a little bit about the difference between Philip and Elizabeth in terms of their self-awareness, but also, their personalities are quite different, their level of ideological commitment is quite different, and what really jumped out for me in the finale is that she's usually the steely one, the ruthless one, and I think that he becomes more steely and ruthless in his own way in this finale. And I think outwardly, the finale feels like it's more his episode, but then you get to the end, and all of this internal stuff is happening with her. She gets the last dream of the series, doesn't she, right? And then look what happens in this dream. She imagines herself with Gregory, and this is an image from early, and Gregory's an art dealer, right?
An art collector.
An art collector, right? Yeah, so he's the art collector, and she has this dream where she imagines it's almost like a sliding doors scenario, where a life without children. This is amazing to me. This is amazing to me. This is some very deep architecture. And again, I have to ask, it sounds like such a obvious question, but you plan everything so meticulously. Is this something that's planned? Do you believe that things like this happen by accident? What do you think about the whole idea of intentionality in storytelling? Like when things like this is obviously something that feels like it was meant to happen. Did you make it happen?
Well, I can honestly say, speaking for myself, but I think I can speak for both of us on this, until we came up with the idea of having the Gregory dream in the finale, which was fairly late in our process, it didn't occur to me that the Erica storyline was inspired by the Gregory storyline, and that there's a reason art would provoke her on an even deeper level, because her first real love here was this guy who was an art collector, and the one thing they couldn't quite connect on, even though he talked about taking her to exhibits and stuff, was that. But once we came up with the idea for that dream, it immediately became clear that that was a big part of the structure of the story, subconsciously.
Yeah, and it's almost like, I think about television shows and movies as almost psychoanalytical objects. Like you can look at them, you can see there are things that they meant to do even if they weren't aware that they were doing them, much like the characters that you're writing. And I feel like something like that is happening here. Like she tries to be an artist at the very end of the story, and she would have theoretically produced art which maybe Gregory would have collected. So Gregory would have been a collector of Elizabeth. It's all this kind of stuff where if you saw it on the legal tablet, you'd go, oh my God, I need a prescription for something.
Yeah.
Well, this is, here at the end of the whole thing, it's very satisfying because a lot of this is a dance between the writers and the directors and the actors and the critics. And, by the way, Carrie, who stared at that picture, could have put her hand up on that window. And then you guys come along and you point things out that we didn't think of or didn't see, but could have well come from any of our unconscious minds. And when these circles start to come together, it's very satisfying. I'll just say that.
So let's jump to the next one. The finale, the very final scene, they're looking out at Russia. Was this always going to be the final scene?
That was always this is, unlike the idea that they were going to go home at the end with none of their kids, with one of their kids, something, that's the part we had from very early, but that was the only part of the ending that we had at the end of season 1, beginning of season 2. All the rest of it was broken, more or less at the end of last year, at the beginning of this year. And when this came up as the final scene, that stuck as the final scene. Unlike other things, it never got moved around. It was always was always the very end.
Though I will say, from a writing standpoint, as hard as we worked on that garage scene, we spent more time on it because it was longer, but we spent a lot of time writing and rewriting this scene, a lot. And then I would say of any scene in the history of the show, including some technically challenging scenes, the suitcase scene, but of any scene in the show, even those that had a lot of shots to them, we spent more time editing this scene than any other scene.
Part of that was pure fussiness. Like we would spend half an hour on, should he go like that?
Yeah.
Did he go like that twice? What about when she went like, did she go like that? Like, I mean, we lost our minds a little bit.
Yeah. What was in and what was out? What did you put in? What did you take out? What was the dance like when you're?
It was less about in and out because I don't. Did we drop? Maybe there were a couple lines that got dropped out. I don't remember.
Drop, put back in. Drop, put back in.
It wasn't about that. It was about every take, every moment, every splice point, every pause. We went a little crazy.
We're obsessed with all that anyway,
Yeah.
but we went full bananas.
Yeah.
Right.
Just
Yeah,
full
yeah, yeah.
bananas. Like the blink.
One of our, Amanda Pollock is here, who edited the show for 6 seasons. Brilliant editor. And
she's sitting there thinking you guys are like that on every
You guys
scene.
are mentally ill. So she suffered through that with us, and it was really bad for all 6 seasons, but it was worst of all on this scene.
That's fantastic. Well, that's something else that I wanted to talk to you about, which is the aesthetic of the show. Well, we'll deal with more in detail in a second, but this idea of leaving spaces, of leaving pauses. One of the things that I'm constantly complaining about in movies and television is everything is very much about get to the point, what's the next plot point? It's all, everybody's just delivering plot points to each other. And this is a show where 2 people will have a conversation in a park, and it will begin with a person sitting in the park, they watch the person approaching, takes them a few seconds, they stand up, they shake hands, they sit down, chit-chat, and then they have the plot stuff. You do that a lot, you're not afraid of it. What's the appeal of that? What does that give you that the more straightforward, let's just get to it approach denies you?
I mean, I'd be interested to hear if you have a more technical answer to that. For me, I'm uncomfortable otherwise. I literally find it too rushed. I sometimes watch, I think a lot of shows are very beautifully edited, but I occasionally watch a show where that stuff is not there at all, and I'm literally like this. I can't, I feel physically uncomfortable. And what happens when you have those spaces, A, it feels more real. You can settle into it and settle out of it, and you can see the expression and the feeling on people's faces and get to know where they're at. I almost can only imagine it that way.
Well, it's so rare for us to have a different answer because our brains have pretty much fused by now. But for me, it's different. I actually, I'm a fan of shows with poppy paste sometimes. I think it's just an aesthetic choice. And for this show, that feeling, what Joe said, the feeling real was the most important thing. And anytime we made a decision that was a shortcut that on any other show might be for pace or action or drama, the whole show kind of fell apart. Then you'd lose this sense of reality. And the concept of the show is already quite heightened, so I think in a lot of ways maybe that was a reason it begged for as much truth as possible.
Also, because it's set in the 80s, I think I perhaps expected it to look more 80s than it did, like sort of stereotypically 80s. I thought when they get deeper into the 80s, they're going to bust out the green and blue and yellow gels, to more tilting and more stuff, to more Tony Scott, but you never did that.
We never did that. I remember talking to our production designer and our costume designer in the first season, and then we repeated this throughout with all of our directors and various crew that, whenever you're in a period of time, here we are, it's 2018, everybody didn't just buy their clothes yesterday and put them on.
Right.
This jacket is 20 years old, I'm sorry to say. So, in order for it to feel real, you can't thin slice out of the era. It has to almost be like a comet's trail. And you have to really pick and choose those moments.
I want to do, I guess, a lightning round and look at some of these characters, and I want you to, one or both of you, to tell me what is the first image or moment that comes to mind. So let's Gad.
Beating up the male robot.
Yeah. Same?
No, you said first thing that came to mind. I was like, oh shit, everybody looks young.
Martha. I was going to say things did not end well for her, but who is that not true for?
I mean, what are you talking about?
I guess things turned out
She's
about
raising a family,
as well as they could have.
Her number
yes.
one thing was she wanted to have a kid. The first thing that came to mind is I didn't like it when people said poor Martha.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, okay, it was horrible, but I get a little defensive about it.
Yeah. Nina.
Her execution was based on research about how they actually executed, not everyone by a long shot, but certain categories of people were executed that way because the Soviets felt it was more humane, that they would not know. Unlike Americans, who they felt would sit there for months knowing their death was coming, they set it up so that you knew for a millisecond and then you were dead. It was meant to be humane.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, next one. Oleg.
You know, boy. You know, the first thing that comes to, I'll tell you what comes to mind for him is he's on a show where people didn't change a lot necessarily, and many people had changed that was incremental. I think about him sitting with no socks in the Residentura, listening to rock and roll, and Arkady shaking his head at him. And then he becomes the guy that on whose door Arkady knocks when he needs help, and he's willing to risk everything for his country, and he gives everything up for his country. It was a beautiful run for Oleg.
He's kind of a stealth. He's one of the stealth great characters for me. Like he doesn't get talked about as much as the leads, but there's something very soulful about that guy. Like he reminds me of like one of those like when Randolph Scott got a little older. You know, there's a depth to him that doesn't announce itself. I really like him. Next one.
I think about him in the pilot, and he was so young, and that ice cream scene, he sat there during the shooting of that scene and consumed a bucket of ice cream. and everybody was like, you gotta stop, you're gonna make yourself sick, and he's eating, and he has blossomed into the loveliest young man, a wonderful kid who everybody adores and loves working with, and we didn't destroy him.
He's a good actor.
He really is.
Very good. Okay. Paige.
You're like doing those pauses from the show.
I'm funny. What occurred to me is, everybody has said, we refuse to answer the question, what happens to Paige next? And I'm not going to answer, but when I saw that, I thought, it would be nice. She should go back to the church. I think that'd be good for Paige. She should. I think it's time. She should refine Jesus. I think it's the best thing for her.
Yeah, that's a good pitch.
That's great. Philip.
I mean, the first thing I thought was that's a weird shot.
I like that because it's a little paranoid thriller-ish.
I see.
It's funny, and I'm just thinking he's like on hold with the Costa Rica cruise guy. He's like, oh God, I promised them the poolside.
The travel agency became like more important than I thought it would be to the plot of the story, and it becomes almost a kind of sadly comical when you get to the end.
Yeah, it really worked out well in the final season to have it there so he could go full on capitalist and then have it not work out. I mean, it's so sad, but as you said, a little bit funny.
It's also such a pathetic business to have been in the 80s, if you know at all what's coming.
Right. Yeah, William Shatner's going to put you out of business, basically. Yeah. No, I just love the idea. To me, it gets funnier as it goes along, the fact that they're travel agents who have to leave at 3 a.m, both of them, to solve a travel emergency somewhere, It's like, and that's something, I've talked to you about this before, but can we speak a little bit about this question of how funny do we want this to be on purpose? Like, isn't that a risk? Like when you have like people in disguise who are married showing up at the other person's fake wedding, and
Well, that was a big moment, the Martha wedding, because I remember that season 1, we talked so much about the tone of that and wanting to get it right and wanting it not to feel farcical. And I think when we saw that worked was a big moment for us too, because the fact that Matthew and Carrie and Margot and Allison could deliver just straight up humanity in those crazy disguises in that zany moment. It felt really beautiful.
it's always like a beat away from turning into like a Steve Martin, Goldie Hawn movie. Sometimes it's such a it's a dark, tough, violent show, but there's this sort of undertone of absurdity to some of the situations.
Well, it's funny you say that, because that exact scene is one of the only ones I remember where we really spent a lot of time talking to everyone about tone. We tended not to talk about tone. The tone of the show was set and seemed to work, but because it was that scene, it was a beat away, and if it tipped over, it was a disaster.
Right.
But and we had to find the words, which were hard to find for the tone we wanted for that scene, and then we held our breath, and then it came back, and we thought it was perfect.
But there was another one, which is, think about it, I'm pretty sure the first time that Elizabeth, maybe the only time Elizabeth tells Philip that she loves him,
Yeah.
she's in disguise as his sister.
Right.
She got that Jennifer wig on, and
I'll tell you who
I
comes
remember
to-
talking about it, and we had a conversation. Should she take the wig off? Because are we to really play this scene with the wig on? And there was this whole discussion.
like,
well, Martha's upstairs, so maybe it's okay, and maybe she'll take it off. And we just decided she wouldn't do it.
It's like Three's Company waiting to happen.
Yeah.
Some of this stuff. It's great. Let's go to the next one. Elizabeth. I know it's hard to choose, but
Yeah, that's a big question.
yeah. I never would have thought that Felicity could be this badass and tortured and dark.
Is this
It's
is this from this season? Or is
No,
this
this is from an earlier season.
Oh yeah,
This is,
no.
I think,
So
from
this is
3
from
or
Get
2.
Back in Here.
Yeah.
This is Get Back in Here.
I spent a lot of time, especially in earlier seasons, feeling defensive for her. I felt, again, this faded a lot as the years went on, but not entirely, that I felt like people judged her and felt she was either a sociopath or a bad mother or all these things. And I spent a lot of time, I felt I needed to defend her and say what was great about her and how she was steadfast and true, and if you would want her on your side, and she wasn't just a pure ideologue. She believed in things that there was a reason to believe in, and she would stand up for that no matter what. And I got prickly about it. I didn't like it when people attacked her too much. It wasn't that there was no truth to any of the things that people were saying. Of course there was, but they weren't seeing the other side. And Philip appreciated those things about her, that he could trust her and count on her under all circumstances, and he loved her for those things. But then sometime around I think middle of the run of the show, it seemed that a lot of people started writing about the good sides of Elizabeth, what was great about her, and a lot of women started holding her up and saying, look, she's like a working mom. She holds down, she's always doing the laundry and then also goes out to work, and then now Philip's not even working, she's like the only one working.
Yeah, she's bringing home the bacon and
Exactly.
KGB bacon.
Exactly. And then I started relaxing.
Although I'll tell you what, I still chafe a bit at this notion of the Americans as an anti-hero show, because in our minds they were never anti-heroes. I mean, I
Right.
loved Sopranos and I loved Breaking Bad. Those were two shows in which those guys, Breaking Bad was called Breaking Bad. You knew that they were bad.
Yeah.
These guys are heroes. They're not anti-heroes. They just happen to be heroes for another side, and a
Right.
side
Right.
that we don't support and may not believe in, and they do horrible things, but heroes do horrible things all the time.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So I think we have time for 3. Oh, yeah, you know what? Before we do this, Renee. I got to ask you about Renee. Okay,
That's, that's Stan's new wife. Yeah.
I've watched this particular moment more times than I've watched the actual episode because I want to know, is she or isn't she? Does she even know? Do you know?
She doesn't know. We know she said she knows, but she doesn't know.
Yeah,
Nobody knows.
nobody knows.
No. We don't even know if we know anymore.
We know. We know.
Do we know?
Well, no, we better say we don't know. I don't want to get kidnapped. We don't know.
All right, so let's take 3 questions. Well, let's wait for the lights to come up. So
Wow,
we can
that's very
see,
specific. 3 questions.
Yeah, well, we're We have to clear out in a minute, so. Here we go. Okay.
Yeah, she's earned a question.
Yeah, come on.
The scene with Stan talking to Henry, do you guys actually write something there? Or when he goes up to New Hampshire?
Oh.
No dialogue there, but we did discuss exactly what was said, which is everything. Yeah.
Okay. Back there. Yes, you. The second row.
Oh, hi. I just want to thank you so much. I just loved all of it. And how are you such evolved men that you can write such strong women?
Oh, here we've got a mic.
Oh, okay. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It was a wonderful show. I'm in mourning, absolutely. It's over. But how are you such evolved men that you can write these dynamic, strong women? I mean, I didn't have to wear stilettos and tight dresses and, all of I never thought poor Martha. She totally had a love of her life, and so it's not typical. And Elizabeth was never deferential. And to me, she was always the hero, and I'm thrilled she got to go back to Russia. I think that was a love story that you gave her. So any thoughts on how you created such strong women? And what we're going to replace it with? There's nothing to replace it with.
Well, first of all, I can't wait to go home and tell my wife about that question.
That's so funny. The same but like mirror answer. I was going to say one of the ways is we both have awesome wives.
It's interesting. We had in our writers' room and with our group of writers, it was sort of a article of faith and how we worked that nobody really thought that much about men, women. I mean, we had women on staff, men on staff, and everybody wrote everything, and everybody was really thought of as people, just people. It was not because these days you hear a lot of talk about who's writing who, and that's just not how we worked. The only thing I ever noticed in the entire run was we did have, at some points, father with teenage kids, or younger than teenagers, who sometimes really kind of took the best cracks at some of the Henry stuff, and a couple of the women who just locked into Paige because of some of the experiences they had had when they were younger. So sometimes it seemed to go generationally like that, gender-wise. But that was it. It didn't, and by the way, a lot of the writing, the way we worked also was every writer took a pass at every script. So, you could, no matter whose name was on it, ours or anybody else's, sometimes people wrote scenes from wildly different things, and any script where there was a scene that somehow wasn't coming together could go out to anybody. And it would just never occur to us that if this was a Philip scene, that a man should do it, or an Elizabeth scene, that a woman should do it, or not. So I think the best answer I could give is just our approach didn't sort of work that way, which I think was to our advantage.
In the front right here. Just wait for the mic.
Well, it's real quick. Claudia, Margot Martindale. Haven't heard anything about her, and also that scene. I'm not sure which episode or what season it was, where Elizabeth beats the shit out of Margot. So that's the one that really got my attention. And but anyway, any thoughts, comments about that character and that actress?
And her pin.
Her pin. She was wearing it last night. She has it now, and she wears it outside of work too.
Well, we love Margot, first of all, as a human being. You don't get more fun or more kind and generous than Margot Martindale, or more talented. And we love that character. We love Claudia. And I think, it was great that Claudia was able to start with the show and finish with the show. It was a challenge. We didn't have a series deal with her. She got a sitcom in the middle of our run. CBS was incredibly generous in terms of letting her come back and do episodes, which was really great. And I think also there was, that character, I think, got to evolve with the show, too, because that character, I think, was not nearly as dimensional in those early episodes in the first season as she became later on. And that was not about Margot. I think it was about our writing and our figuring out what the show was and how to fill out the characters. So it was good to be able to have her there for the whole run.
Great, thank you.
We had her here at Split Screens last year talking about Sneaky Pete and the Americans. And it had one of the best moments that I've had interviewing somebody, which is she's from Texas, as you know. And I said, well, I'm also from Texas. I'm from Dallas. And she stared at me. And I said, I don't know if you consider that Texas. And she said, I don't. So, another one? Okay. Right there. Yes.
With respect to what happens to Russia later, that Putin takes over, was your rule, we're going to pretend we don't know that? Was your rule where you're showing how that could happen later? Or and from the beginning to the end, the role, what you thought of Russia must have changed. Can you talk about the politics post the 1997 and how it affected this?
Well, our rule was, as writers, we don't know it. We don't want a single line to creep into the show that appears as if the writers are commenting on anything current or anything after the end of the show. We thought that would sort of break the spell. So we talked about it at lunch, and we thought about it, and I don't think I want to get too much into what I think about the current politics, because I'd talk for hours and hours, and I think we're down to our last seconds. But we really tried to keep it out of the show.
Another one. Right on the front, in the corner. Here's a mic.
You guys had made a comment that you were going to hell for one of the scenes in the show. I still can't figure out which one that is.
That was the other parking garage scene this season.
It's a relief that it wasn't obvious. Maybe we're not going.
Hey, just purgatory.
Okay. Next one, right one back, yeah.
Do you feel like you need some time to breathe before your next project, or are you hungry do you feel a void and you want to keep going right away?
No void. Breathing.
Breathing's good,
Yeah,
yeah.
we're taking the summer off.
Yeah.
Good. One back.
Regarding the storyline of Misha Phillips' Secret Son season 5, was the execution of it was it always set in stone, or did you go back and change it? Was it always that he was never going to meet Philip?
I don't think we ever had him meeting Philip. Never.
We discussed
Never.
it. We discussed it, but I don't think we ever really
it was
broke
always
that story.
It was always going to be intercepted. There was just a technical challenge there, which was Frank Langella doesn't speak Russian. So we had to figure out a way to construct that scene so they were in public enough so that he would have to speak enough English to have a scene. And it was very delicate actually to film it, because they had to be in private enough to have that conversation and yet in public enough to necessitate the English. But I forget who directed that. I think Amanda.
No, I thought no. Oh,
Did
no.
Amanda edited that, right?
Yeah, Noah directed
Did Noah
it,
direct
didn't
that scene? Yeah, Noah Emmerich directed it and did it brilliantly, and Amanda Pollock edited it.
Also, what was sorry to interrupt, just what was the hope? I love the storyline, don't get me wrong, but what was the point of it if they were never going to meet? You just kind of shut them off in the middle of the season.
It's a fair question. I think some people were like, "What are you, crazy? There has to be a collision at the end of it." But I think for us, we were guided, as we always were, by what felt real. And even if sort of classical drama rules say they have to meet, we're more interested in reality and in how the handlers in the KGB might try to interfere and might not want them to meet. And if that was going to hold sway, then the sort of the tragedy and the pain and Philip never knowing, we just liked that story. It felt like a truer story.
Maybe they'll meet now.
Yes. Way back there. Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the 5th season and whether your plans for it ever changed, and perhaps you'll disagree with this characterization, but I would say that it was perhaps a bit more meditative than the other seasons. So
Season 5?
Season 5, yes.
That was a very delicate word. We like the word meditative.
Meditating
Let's
is
just all
so nice.
agree with that.
Everybody should meditate.
If you don't-
at least once every 5
If you don't
seasons.
like, I've actually made that distinction. If you don't like it, it's slow, and if you like it, it's meditative. That's how it goes. So you win. Everything's good.
You know, it's interesting. When we made that season, we were sort of in the same place we always are when we make our seasons. You know, we breaking the stories and telling the stories, and we felt great about it. We loved that season. We were deep into the character stories. We absolutely knew that it had less action. We absolutely knew that it was slower. We sort of openly talked about, hey, there's less conflict than in any of the other seasons. We would sort of joke, hey, this is the season without any conflict. But we thought, that's okay, we're going to do it a little differently this season. We're just delving into these characters and their stories and what's going on in their emotional lives. Okay.
Well, we also had felt like, you know, for 4 seasons, we really had this escalating conflict between Philip and Elizabeth, and there was a real danger that that would just begin to circle around itself. And we thought it'd be interesting to do a chunk of story where it was them together and their conflict was more externalized. And look, that's the season where they got married. Yeah. So, you know, we wanted to get them there. We wanted to get them to a good place before utterly destroying it.
Yes.
Thanks.
And I love that it's the priest who marries them who ultimately is the knife twister at the end there.
Well, it was, the fact that they took off their disguises.
Yeah. It's very Godfather, that whole aspect of it. I love that. So again, here we go. Over there. Sure.
I wanted to know, why didn't you end it during the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89? Just extend it a little further.
Well, a couple reasons. You know, we knew from the start, or at least soon after the start, we realized a couple things. One was that just the way we tell story, people always say the show is a slow burn, which is true, but also the way we tell story, chronologically, we just realized we moved very slowly through time. I mean, really just on an episode-by-episode basis, on how many days pass in an episode, season to season, we just barely traversed any time. So we didn't even know if we would ever even get to Gorbachev. I mean, we was just crawling along, and it was only by taking a very large time jump between 5 and 6 that we could even get to Gorbachev, which we thought was incredibly important to sort of bring all the history together. And to make it a couple more years was too big of a jump. There was also a sort of a technical problem with the kids, which is they weren't growing enough to justify even bigger time jumps. So between those two things. We also, you know, although there would have been something cool about that, we actually liked it better to sort of end without the place collapsing. It just felt better from a character point of view with what we could do and leave that sort of looming in the future.
Well, you also avoided that sort of easy parallelism that often,
Yep.
even good writers can't resist doing that when they're telling a story set against history. We're like, what's happening with the characters mirrors what's happening exactly politically.
Right. If you can resist Misha meeting his father, you can resist the Berlin Wall collapsing.
Right, exactly. It's that Russian discipline that you have, that you both have. Yes, okay, so we have time for one more question. Let's say way in the back, yes.
Hi. Using the example of Oleg, who starts the series, with the spring in his step and this light in his eyes, and by the end of it is just entirely disheveled. You see him sort of hunch over gradually as the series goes on, and that physical evolution is true for almost all the characters. I was curious in terms of the dynamic. How much of that is you putting that on the page, and how much of that is the actors bringing it in themselves, the physical evolution?
Well, we don't put any physicality on the page. We tend to write with very, very sparse scene description. That said, we have tone meetings that can go on sometimes for a full day, where we dive deep into every single scene and talk to the director and all of the production team about what the creative and dramatic intent is of everything. But in terms of how a character gets physicalized, that's something that's discovered with the actors and the directors.
Just, by the way, please don't tell the other audiences, but this is clearly the best audience ever. So thank you guys. Really, I mean, unbelievable. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Well, I just want to say, on behalf of myself and probably everybody here, wow, what a great job. What a great job you guys did. And it's really, yeah. It's a thing of beauty of a very particular sort. You know, like there are a lot of things that are beautiful and you go, oh my God, wow. It's like coming at you with the flowing robes and, you know, the wind and the choir music. This is more like a 1940s crime thriller that the French would discover. It's like that's the way this thing is beautiful. Like it's very like the discipline required not to wear all of your themes and your symbols on your sleeve. I can't resist that, and I'm not even a fiction writer. And it's amazing that you did it, and it's gonna stand the test of time. I'm absolutely certain of it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Joel
Thank you
Fields
very
and
much.
Joe Weisberg.
Thank you.